when you open the door for somebody else.
Welcome back to the Vaccine Conversation with Melissa and Dr. Bob. It's good to be back.
Where did you go?
I didn't go anywhere.
Oh.
Well, I guess I keep apologizing to the audience because we've been only posting one show a week.
And you should apologize because this has nothing to do with me. I just want everybody to know that it should absolutely be a Dr. Bob apology.
Okay.
So I'm glad
Do
you're
you
finally...
need more? Was that enough? Or
There could be a little groveling. I think they'd appreciate a little groveling. We are back with an interesting, I think, topic today about vaccine exemptions. So,
wait, time out. Before
yeah.
you go forward with your topic, I had one little sort of side item I wanted to read because I don't think you're aware of this.
Okay, go ahead.
There is, I have to take my glasses off because it's really small. And I was shocked. There's a measles epidemic in San Francisco.
Oh, no.
The headline's 247 new measles cases in San Francisco epidemic. I just read it. It's very short, but it's very, very interesting. An epidemic of measles among the city's children was reported by the public health department yesterday. Last week, 247 new cases were reported. Normal number of cases expected is usually about 25. The total for the year so far has now reached 948 cases. The big increase in the familiar childhood disease gives no cause for alarm, in the opinion of Dr. Sage, Assistant Public Health Director. Dr. Sage is quoted as, "Measles epidemics are periodic things. They come along every 6 or 7 years and spread to new generations of children." Dr. Sage said the familiar red spots, which characterize the disease, usually disappear in a week or so. Measles is not serious for children, but the youngsters should be kept warm and dry to recover quickly. Parents have been advised to keep school children stricken at home for 10 days to 2 weeks. Dr. Sage said the measles upswing started about 2 months ago. And he's quoted again, "This just seems to be a measles year. One good thing, once a youngster has had measles, he is immune for the future." Yeah, and this was February. Oh, this is February 23rd, 1951. Oh, weird. That was like 70 years ago. So yeah, so I don't know. Maybe I thought this was new or something.
Wait, are you serious?
No, really, no. It's 1951.
I know. I mean, I knew that, but wait, did you really think it was new?
No, I didn't. I was just playing it off. But I mean, it just kind of shocks me that the public health officer 70 years ago, back when, we didn't even have, modern medicine, would call measles just this routine childhood disease. There's no cause for worry. Just keep your kids, what do you say? Keep your kids warm and dry. Stay at home for 2 weeks. And the good thing is, you're immune for life. And to me, that's kind of just shocking that they'll portray, that's how everyone used to think of measles way back then.
And this is before the vaccine was licensed for universal use.
Exactly,
yeah. About 12 years before that.
Yeah, exactly. And pre-vaccine, every disease is kind of looked at as, not every disease, but a lot of diseases are looked at as just routine childhood diseases. And as soon as we make a vaccine for something, it instantly becomes a pariah and something deadly and something dangerous that you don't want to catch. You certainly don't want to catch and get that natural lifetime immunity. And so it's just kind of...
So in case anybody was having a panic attack, there are not 247 new cases in San Francisco today. This was 1951, right? You said?
Yeah, 1951. And this was, came across my desk and I was like, oh, it's just so shocking the huge difference between what a measles headline is today. It's a deadly disease. It kills hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. You have to run out and get the vaccine, and it's just kind of interesting where we've come, right?
Well, I'm so glad you interjected that aside.
Did I fool you at all in any way?
Considering it has nothing to do with exemptions, that was super. Thank you for that.
I don't know if I didn't have you going for a second there.
No,
you weren't. Okay. Right.
Because what happens now is an outbreak is 3 cases.
Right.
So you know that when you hear of 3 cases, it's all over the news. And if there were 247 cases this week, it would have been even more so all over the news.
And how deadly it is.
And the thing that they're so concerned with, as they say with all these laws that keep coming up in different states, is they're concerned with the increase or the existence of vaccine exemptions, what they consider non-medical vaccine exemptions, and in some cases, even medical exemptions, like we saw in California. So a non-medical vaccine exemption would be a personal belief exemption, a conscientious exemption, or a religious exemption. And these are typically something you'll see between 3 to 5% of a population, usually not more than that, unless there's one particular community that is a religious community. But statewide, and even usually countywide, we see about 3 to 5% only. That's when they're completely allowed before they were getting stricter on things. And as you know, the quoted herd immunity rates are at 95%. So even with 3 to 5%, we should be completely at the point of comfort for population coverage. And what we see is the discrepancy we see is typically among children who are conditional entrants, or they are overdue for their doses. So they are on track to be fully vaccinated because that's what their family has decided for, but maybe they're missing a few doses. So the low vaccination rates, or the assumed to be low vaccination rates, are not usually almost never related to children with exemptions. And we just saw this over this last year, a new proposed law in California that passed, which was actually going after and targeting 0.7% of the population, which means 99.3% of school children in California did not have a medical exemption. Now, remember, in California, they've already removed the non-medical vaccine exemptions. But I came across these studies that were talking about kids with vaccine exemptions and looking into the data about who they are, who their parents are, what kind of things children are opting out of, et cetera. And I found it really interesting. If you really understood who the kids with vaccine exemptions were, you'd see that there was no cause for concern. And so we're going to go into those two studies today. I'm going to list them for you so that you know the names of them, even though they will be in the link of our information on whatever platform you use to listen to this in the description. And they are also found on our Facebook page for Immunity Education Group under the pinned post, as well as our website, which has been down a few times over the last couple of weeks. So if that's happened to you, don't worry, we're going to get it fixed. And it's not evil censorship at work, which is what I've had a few messages about.
Right.
So the names of the two studies. First one, parental vaccine refusal in Wisconsin, a case control study. This was 2009. And the second one, vaccination coverage rates and factors associated with incomplete vaccination or exemption among school-aged children based in public schools in New York State, 2016. So these two studies I found to be pretty interesting because as I started to go through them, actually one of them led me to the other one. As I started to go through them, even I was sort of surprised by some of the things that were said. So I guess not this first point. The first point, what are the vaccines that were most often refused? What do you guys think, listeners? What do you think the vaccines that are most often refused for children who have exemptions? If you guessed chickenpox and hepatitis B, you would be right. Now, we're talking about, this is kind of before HPV had really come around and was starting to be on the childhood list, because that's another one you see a lot of people opting out of, or certainly out of the full series. But the vaccines that were most often refused were chickenpox and hepatitis B. And it says about 50% of exempt children were exempted for chickenpox vaccine. And they decided they wanted to get it natural, get the illness naturally, and the parents did not see it as, quote, that big of a deal. And for hepatitis B, it was about a 30% opt-out rate. So about half of the people with exemptions are opting out for chickenpox. And what we saw in California, as you know, Dr. Bob, is if you opt out of chickenpox because your child has naturally gotten it, you have to get a medical exemption for that, to be opting out of that to go for school entry. So there are children that literally had a medical exemption in California because they had chickenpox naturally. And that might have been the only thing they were getting a medical exemption for, which I think most people don't really understand. We were already talking about such a small percentage, but even out of that percentage, some of them are just exempted for something that 20 years ago, every single child got and nobody saw it as any kind of risk. And what I'm going to hypothesize here is in about 20 years from now, chickenpox is going to be the new measles. It's going to be the new scare.
Totally is, yeah.
It's very contagious. The vaccine works pretty effectively, and it's going to be a fear campaign about why it's not okay to get it naturally anymore.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I know we're probably going to go over this later, but just also to sort of summarize, you mentioned the two vaccines that were most commonly opted out of for these, families with personal or religious exemptions. What's interesting is the diseases, like no one worries about chickenpox or hepatitis B going around. What people do worry about going around is measles, and people worry about polio coming back, and people worry about whooping cough outbreaks, even though the vaccine doesn't stop that. Interestingly, those were the lowest exempted vaccines. Like someone who labeled themselves as having a personal or religious exemption, the numbers that actually opted out of whooping cough and MMR vaccine, it was about 10%. It was roughly about 10%. Only 10% of people opted out of those. That means 90% of people with personal exemptions actually opted in for the DTP vaccines, the MMR. And then only something like 5% or even less than 5%, maybe 3% opted out of polio vaccine. That means almost everyone viewed polio vaccine as important enough to get. And the reality is these families are picking and choosing. They're choosing the vaccines they deem as more important, and they're getting them, and very few of them are opting out of the very diseases.
Everyone's worried about.
Everyone's
exemptions.
worried about, yeah. So you're worried. The media's all worried about measles and whooping cough, and you're going around and polio coming back. Well, almost all of these exempted kids are getting those vaccines anyway.
Right.
So you can't look at as all these kids hurting herd immunity, from the media standpoint, because it's just not true. Yeah,
and that's one of the things that I remember talking to legislators about back in 2015, this idea that most children with exemptions are partially vaccinated. Mm-hmm. And when kids are partially vaccinated, they tend to get the things that they feel are maybe the strongest, the biggest risk associated with, or something that a doctor has told them is the strongest risk. And also, we might look at some of these as children who have gotten those stronger vaccines that are more likely to have side effects, where those kids would, at that point, realizing that they shouldn't get any more, are not going to be getting things on the periphery. And they're going to only be getting, like they've already gotten maybe some of the ones that might have triggered some kind of adverse reaction, and then they're opting out of things from that point on. But by then, because they're, these are things you're getting in infancy and up to 12 months, these are things they've already had. And it's funny because I think most people don't understand how few people are truly completely unvaccinated. Like we've said, it's roughly around 1%, 1.2%. Sometimes it's been 0.8%. It's roughly around 1% of the nation, and we've seen those same numbers by state, about the same numbers. 1% means 99% are vaccinated, and this idea that there is an increase in the number of unvaccinated kids, and therefore an increase in exemptions. And that's why we see the return of these illnesses that they say were once eradicated or once on the verge of elimination. It's not actually accurate when you go into the data. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I found, and I'm wondering if I found it in this study or not, I guess it was on another one, that the average child with an exemption has had, I believe it was 22 doses of vaccines.
Right.
And the average child who is completely up to date by kindergarten age has had an average of 28 doses. So we're talking about a difference in 6 doses from a kid who has an exemption and a kid who does not have an exemption, which means these kids are almost the same. I mean, when you think of a child with an exemption, you assume this is an unvaccinated child with an uneducated parent. This is what somebody would assume. And if you find out that child, the average is 22 doses, which means some of those kids have had even more, have had even more than that. 22 doses is a lot by 4 years old. That is a lot for a child who's asking to be exempted from something else. Right. We're not talking about a fully vaccinated kid. We're talking about one that you're worried about, because this is a kid who has an exemption that you think these laws need to get stricter and they need to get tighter to get rid of these exemptions because they're so dangerous. And the kid who's got the exemption has 22 doses, and those doses, like you're saying, are likely from MMR, polio, DTaP, the things that people are worried about. I truly believe it comes down to just a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding about who these children really are, for people to even want to support these kinds of mandates. And, one of the things in this study, the first study we're talking here about parental vaccine refusal in Wisconsin, the 2009 study, it says the most common factor in why parents exempt their children from certain vaccine doses is, not surprisingly, safety. Right? The quote that they used was, vaccines may cause harm. It says parents of fully vaccinated children were less likely to report concerns about vaccine safety. They didn't question the need for immunization, and they didn't oppose immunization requirements. But the ones that were looking for exemptions their concern was vaccine safety. And again, like I said, that could have been from personal experience, the personal experience of a loved one, something that they've seen happen to their own child or a child that they knew. And now they're asking questions about, is the safety really there? And that is why they're looking to get an exemption. So not totally surprising, but a little surprising that there really isn't an investigation into safety for those that are fully vaccinated, right? The parents of fully vaccinated kids, they're not looking into it. They're not, it's not that they feel confident that they're safe. They really just aren't going there.
Right. But I kind of thought it was really interesting. I was very surprised by this one. I'll probably give you all the numbers on this later, but they actually found that parents who chose to actually vaccinate their children, 25% of those parents actually did feel that children are getting more immunizations than are good for them. And these are vaccinating parents. A quarter of them thought there were too many vaccines. And actually, a third of them, 34%, expressed concern that children's immune systems could be weakened by too many immunizations. And it kind of just surprises me that if 25% of these parents feel that children are getting too many shots and that vaccines can actually weaken their immune system, why are they vaccinating?
Fully vaccinated. Yeah.
Why are they fully vaccinated, especially in a state where the vaccines are not mandated, like Wisconsin?
So you're talking 1 in 4 and 1 in 3. If you have a concern that your child's immune system could be weakened by having too many, and then other ones thinking kids are getting too many, they're getting more, quote, was more than are good for them, which means some may be bad for them. Right. That's what it means. It's not just, I'm unsure. It's, I think they are getting more than are good for them. But then they are still 1 in 3 are still going to go forward with that, having that concern. They're going to still go forward with that and fully vaccinate. I had that down here too, because I found that to be interesting. And maybe it comes down to the fact that because this is so socially taboo to discuss these things. And this is 2009. So by then there was quite a bit of controversy around this debate. So it's not acceptable to discuss this with your friends, your family, and even your doctor. And so you're going to have these concerns as a parent, and you're going to squash them and just swallow your concerns and essentially just move on with your life, which is so sad and disturbing as it relates to how you can parent the most effective way for your child. You don't get to listen to any of that because you're so afraid of what somebody might think that you just stay quiet. Yeah,
I know. And it's sad that the default decision is to go ahead and vaccinate. You sort of automatically are going to vaccinate unless you decide, hey, maybe there's something I should opt out of. And again, I would love to find out these parents, what goes through their mind. If they know they're getting more than is good for them and that it will likely weaken their immune system, that would be an interesting study. What goes into their head that makes them go ahead with it anyway, because those concerns are not enough to override the default, just compliant decision that they're kind of automatically making.
And so interestingly, it was about, there are, out of all children with exemptions, 85% were vaccinated. 85% of children with exemptions were vaccinated, either partially or in some cases, 30% of parents actually reported their children were fully up to date. But the school records were inaccurate, files were lost, vaccines were received in different locations, or the child experienced chickenpox naturally. So they were marked down as a child with an exemption who's unvaccinated.
Exactly. 30%, the parents just couldn't track down all the vaccine records, so it was easier on the school form to check exemption and just go into school as an exempt child because you just
Didn't
don't
have the
feel like
records
getting
to-
all the records tracked down.
And
Yeah.
here's why this is important. We have these state level estimates of exemptions, okay, that the state gives. These are the estimates of the children with exemptions, and they're overestimating the number of children who are actually susceptible to these vaccine targeted illnesses. Okay, so the states are overestimating the number of children that are susceptible
Right.
or potential carriers or potentially risking other children in these schools for these vaccine targeted illnesses. Because truthfully, the children that have exemptions are often already covered for these things. Maybe they've had the illness naturally, or again, records have been lost. There's some other issues there. It's not indicative. An exemption is not indicative of an unvaccinated child that has no coverage. And therefore, the schools that they are targeting now with these kinds of state mandates are going to be targeting situations that don't have an issue, which is why we've not seen a case of measles in any school and why the outbreaks are not coming as a result of
Right.
unvaccinated
Right.
kids. We're seeing outbreaks of pertussis amongst fully vaccinated communities. We are seeing no cases of measles in any school setting, at least in our state here in California, which has 40 million people. So it's a pretty big indicator, I think, of a well-populated, well-traveled area.
What I find interesting, if you look at all the reasons why people are claiming a religious or personal exemption. So basically, about half of people were worried that vaccines would cause harm. About 40% actually thought it was better to get a natural disease than a vaccine. People could argue maybe that's true for chickenpox. About 40% thought their children were just not at risk for the disease. 30% were worried about autism and mercury, that vaccines might overload the immune system. That's about 30% of people. 20% simply viewed the diseases as not dangerous. 15% thought that the vaccine just might not work. About 15% also had ethical or moral issues. 10% of people opt out because they know there are fetal tissues used in vaccines. And then again, about in this sampling, 10% just wanted to get their kids enrolled in school without delay. About 10% distrust the government. And about 1% claim is basically contrary to the religious beliefs. So it's kind of interesting to see the percentages kind of the different reasons, but the overriding percent or reason is about they're worried that vaccines might cause harm, and so parents are not opting in to these vaccines.
And so in the survey, they also coincidentally asked these parents about whether or not they trusted the government. And I find that so interesting, right? They always want to paint these parents who ask questions about a medical intervention with a really spotty safety risk profile. They are asking these parents questions like this. Do you trust the government? Because they really want to paint a picture that we are these extremists and we are completely out there, non-rational, or irrational, illogical people. And we've talked about this. And so it says only 24% of children with exemptions trusted the government, but only 30% of the fully vaccinated parents trusted the government, which means these numbers are almost identical. So this just goes to show you this is not trusting the government or not believing that the government is completely transparent with information has nothing to do with your ability to cipher through information and put together intellectual arguments. And even the data in this case, these numbers are almost identical between the groups that had exemptions and the groups that were fully vaccinated. And the bottom line is most people just don't trust the government. That was 70 to 75% of all of the parents in both groups did not trust the government. And that's what's kind of interesting, right? Because if you don't trust the government or you have feelings you don't trust the government, and the natural conclusion would be you don't think they're being completely upfront and honest with information. And if you know that, why do so many parents protest the idea that the CDC might be lying to us, or that any of these medical organizations, the AAP, the ACIP, that they might be manipulating the truth? If you know you don't trust the government, you know not information is not always given in a transparent way. Yeah. Why is it so hard to believe for people that when we talk about vaccine safety and the lack of vaccine safety science and the fact that they know that their kids are getting injured and they're covering it up, why do so many people look at like, that's crazy. That's such a conspiracy. But yet data shows 70% of these fully vaccinated parents don't trust the government. Where's the disconnect happening, do you think, between the government and then the organizations that oversee the vaccine program?
I think a lot of it is, unfortunately, that the media has painted the picture that it's wrong to not vaccinate. It's just plain wrong. The right decision is to vaccinate. They've actually trained our society to accept that belief. So even if you don't trust the government and you don't trust the vaccine policymakers and you don't trust the vaccine makers because they don't have liability, and even though you know all these things, I almost feel like it's a more difficult action step to act on those beliefs, and to act on that distrust, because the media has just trained us so well that, even though there's these problems, oh gosh, if you don't vaccinate, you're going to be ostracized from society, you'll be kicked out of your family, you'll lose your friends, you might cause a disease outbreak, and vaccines are safe and effective anyway. So it is interesting that, I don't know why, but I'd say it just has a lot to do with the media, and that is a really powerful influence that's obviously superseding people's mistrust of government.
But is the media also telling these parents not to trust the government? So, like,
no, I don't think so.
You don't think the media also buys into the idea that the government's corrupt, or these are sleazy politicians and we shouldn't trust these people? I feel like the media does a pretty good job of kind of scandalizing politicians and politics.
Well, they do, but it's more like whatever party's in power, the media attacks that party. Or, whatever party the president's part of, the media attacks the president. The media attacks the people in power. But I don't think that the media really promotes the idea that you can have general distrust of the actual government.
I mean, I don't know if they say it straight up like that, but I feel like they sort of, with their ability to attack people in high positions. And I mean, some of the attacks, even in the last several years, the last 4 or 5 years, I mean, it's pretty shocking, the kind of things you see in media.
But I think it's this person is a bad person, but government is great. Our government is a great institution. They're here to protect us. They're here to serve us. There's
so just the people,
people
serving in government are bad, but the government itself is totally fine.
Right, because I think the media used to hold the government accountable, and we've said that many times. The media is the fourth branch of government. They're supposed to hold the government accountable. They've completely lost that. So you're right. Now they'll attack individuals. They'll attack certain people in power when something goes wrong, or they're trying to influence party politics. But no, I think they've completely lost any ability to criticize the government as a whole. And that's, again, part of the problem when so many of the public mistrust the government.
Well, and one of the things I wonder, too, is saying it's okay to have mistrust of the government is one thing, but because most adults were vaccinated as children, that's already happened to us. And because most people blindly followed the protocol with their children, that's already happened to them too. I think it's one of those things that even if you know the government is maybe not to be completely trusted, it's too far to go there in your brain to understand that something might have gone wrong with you, or you might have allowed something to go wrong with your child. And it's this whole idea of, let's just pretend this isn't happening, and I'm going to fervently defend over here because I can't really digest the idea that this whole thing has been somewhat of a sham, and there's been, information hidden from me because they're already in my body. They've been in my system, and I've put them in all my kids' systems. I can't even conceptualize that, so I'm not going to, and I'm going to fight the other way.
No, you're right. It's easier just to move on. I'll be honest. I mean, it's hard. I mean, when I'm in the office and I'm very upfront with patients about how I view, vaccine-informed consent and vaccine risk and disease risk. And it's hard when I see a family feel forced and pressured into vaccinating, even though they don't want to, but they now feel compelled and coerced to do it in order to send their kids to school. And the family says, will my child be okay? Was my child going to suffer a bad reaction? It's a tough position for me to be in because I know they've already decided to vaccinate. And I know they've decided to vaccinate with all the informed consent process that I put them through. And so now what am I supposed to say? Oh, don't worry, Mrs. Jones, your child's going to be fine because they've already made that decision. Or do I say there is risk? There is risk of side effects. Your child, could have these, several vaccine reactions. It's kind of an uncomfortable position. And it's like I'm very upfront with them, but there comes a point where they've already made the decision. And so do I keep kind of, making, double and triple sure that they're, totally getting informed consent? Or do I kind of hold their hand and say it's going to be okay because I want it to be okay?
Sure.
And in most cases it is okay. But it's a tough, I don't know, it's kind of an
tough line to walk.
Interesting place for me to be. And I find myself in the office now with these new laws.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because even in this study, they say only 65% of parents that have fully vaccinated children, so only 65%, actually said that vaccines were mostly or very protective, which means 35% of those that gave their children everything did not believe they were mostly or very protective. And then that makes you wonder, why are you getting them at that point? And listen to this, even worse, you guys, only 37% of parents of fully vaxxed children, 37%, thought that vaccines were mostly or very safe.
Yes.
That means 65% of parents who got their children fully vaccinated did not think that vaccines were mostly or very safe.
Right.
They did not think that they were safe. And then a good portion of them did not think that they were protective. And like you're saying, yet they are going through with it. And you wonder, when do they come to this point where they have these realizations about safety and efficacy? Is this after their children are kind of already fully vaccinated and now they're starting to wonder and think about it? When were these questions asked of these people? I'm curious what age these children were.
Yeah.
Because if you sat there and told me that you didn't have a view that they were very safe and you didn't even think they were very protective, it would be pretty clear that you are not going to just blindly be like, okay, load them up with everything that is possible for them. You'd be one of the kids in the other side of the study, which is the ones that maybe are exempting from certain things, and you're picking and choosing the ones that you want. A true cost benefit analysis, which is the thing I always advise. I'll get people that message me and go, what do you think I should get? I'm like, that's up to you and your healthcare practitioner to decide. But what I would say is do a cost benefit analysis for every single dose of every single vaccine. You have to know that each thing is necessary at that time and that the benefit outweighs the risk at that time for your child, where you live, in the circumstances you have, whether or not you're breastfeeding, whether or not the child's at home or in daycare, if there are siblings, what region you're in. I mean, there are so many things to put together. That conversation should be happening for every single dose, in my opinion.
Yeah. And, I love the data that you just started to describe a couple of minutes ago, because it's a very, very fascinating table in that they compare the families who opt out of vaccines and they compare it to the opinions of the families who opt in for vaccines. And when they did this study, they basically compared 236 families who were exempt and 727 families who were vaccinated. Those are sort of the raw numbers. What I found fascinating is how similar the two groups are. Whether you decide to opt out and label yourself as exempt, or you decide to opt in and you label your child as vaccinated, the overall opinions of disease severity and vaccine safety were actually not that different. And I want to tell you the numbers because this kind of fascinates me. Well, for parents who opted out and they were exempt, 14% of those families felt that their children were susceptible to severe diseases. 14%. The families who vaccinated, 28% of them felt that there was a very high level of disease susceptibility. Only 28% of vaccinated families felt that the diseases were posing this big risk. Kind of find that interesting. So that means most families don't see that their kids are very susceptible to these diseases. And when you look at disease severity, comparing the two groups are actually closer. The exempt families, 28% of them felt the diseases were very severe, and they were deciding to opt out anyway. Only 41% of the vaccinated families felt the diseases were very severe. When you look at vaccines, when you look at vaccine efficacy, 41% of families who were exempt actually agreed that vaccines were effective, 41%. So it's not that a lot of them felt that just vaccines are worthless. 41% felt like vaccines actually work. And 65% of the vaccinated families felt that vaccines have high efficacy, which I think is the number you just said. Only 65% felt like vaccines really work very well. Yet, so many are vaccinating. But those groups they're not that far apart. And then when they finally finishing with vaccine safety, 21% of exempt families actually felt that, yes, they agree vaccines are safe. 21% felt they were safe. They did not have a worry about safety. 37% of vaccinating families felt that vaccines have a high level of safety.
Right. That was what I quoted earlier.
Yes, what you quoted. But what I find interesting is just the difference between the two groups. The ones that opt out of vaccines, they don't actually have hugely different opinions about disease severity and susceptibility and vaccine efficacy and safety than the vaccinating families do. And again, it sort of speaks to, if we got a lot of these families in the same rooms together and got them to listen to each other and talk to each other and become friends and get to know each other, we'd find that a lot of us have a lot in common, and we're pretty similar in our core beliefs. And it seems that very few people really buy into all the media hype and what the media is trying to make this issue out to be. Because I think we're all a lot more similar than people think we are.
Well, what's funny is even with this study, as much information as we're able to find in this study, I laugh because at the end it's like, quote, this research was funded by a grant from the CDC. And so even funded by the CDC, so that kind of tells you maybe the slant of what the results needed to show. But even with whatever slant that was there, we were still able to find this many things that were interesting. And this again was a study of 963 children in Wisconsin, both with and without non-medical exemptions.
A few of the other differences that again, this is all numbers and data. Sorry, it's kind of maybe a little boring, but again, I love it when they compared the answers of the two groups, because we've given you a lot of the answers in one group or the other group, but I love comparing them side by side. So when they asked both exempt and vaccinated families if children should only be immunized against serious diseases, the percentages were about the same. Exempt families, 66% of exempt families felt you should only be immunized against serious diseases. But 60% of vaccinated families agreed with that as well. The two groups kind of had the same viewpoint as far as children should only be immunized against serious diseases, about 60% on each side. And then again, a lot more exempt families felt that you were getting more vaccines than are good for you, 62%. When you look at the concern about your immune system can be weakened by too many vaccines, we already told you what the vaccinated people felt, about 1/3. 2/3 of the exempt families felt you could have your immune system weakened. When they asked, this is kind of interesting, when they asked, immunizations are one of the safest forms of medicine ever developed, only 73% of vaccinated families agreed. But actually 42% of exempt families agreed, which I kind of find surprising. I would think fewer exempt families would agree that safest forms of medicine ever developed. But these are the data. When they asked, immunizations are getting better and safer all the time as a result of medical research, 95% of vaccinated families agree with that, which sort of goes into just sort of the media and the mob mentality. Well, they're getting a lot safer. 95% of people agree with that. But many people of the vaccinating group felt that vaccine too many were not good for them, or they could be weakened. Anyway, moving on. Asked if vaccines strengthen the immune system, only 84% of vaccinators agreed. 44% of exempt families did not agree. Vaccines do more harm than good. 26% of exempt families agree with that. And 2% of vaccinating families feel that immunizations do more harm than good. And then I'll just end with this one. Parents should be allowed to send their children to school, even if not vaccinated. 74% of exempt families agree with that. But 34% of vaccinating families agree that parents should still be able to send their children to school if not vaccinated. So we have a lot of support among the vaccinating crowd. 34% of them feel that, the children should still be allowed to go to school. That means more of them feel the other way. But anyway, you can see these data, but I kind of feel like there's a lot of interesting ways you could look at this and discuss it, and that there's some differences between our groups, but in a lot of ways we have some of the similar viewpoints about vaccines.
The other study, just briefly, only had a few points. This is called Vaccination Coverage Rates and Factors Associated with Incomplete Vaccination or Exemption Among School-Aged Children Based in Public Schools in New York State. This is 2016. There are only 2 points I really thought were really interesting here, and then I brought 2 other studies actually that I didn't realize I had to kind of reinforce what we're saying. But basically, what they found was out of 5,900 missed vaccine doses, so we're almost 6,000 missed vaccine doses, more than 5,000, so about 85% of the missed doses were unrelated to vaccine exemptions, meaning all the doses that they're studying here about the kids that were missing what they considered necessary for school entry. 85% of all missed doses among school children in New York were unrelated to vaccine exemptions. These children did not even have a vaccine exemption. They did not have a religious exemption, a personal exemption, or anything else. At this time, I think religious was the only thing that was left, but they did not even have an exemption. These are children who were fully vaccinating, but just behind on their doses, missing, hadn't gone to the doctor, et cetera. And we found that to be true, across the states as we've looked at our own state data, but 85%, meaning if you passed a law taking the religious exemption away, which they did at the end of last year, it's not going to change the missed doses because these are kids who didn't even have an exemption. So this is what I'm talking about is if you knew the data, if you actually knew the data, you would see that these types of laws will not do anything because they're not actually targeting kids that are responsible for anything wrong. And the other point that I thought was interesting here was they talked about children with lower socioeconomic status and how those were children that were less likely to have received the complete series of required vaccines. Again, children without exemptions. These are children who do not have vaccine exemptions. And they're missing doses in this case in a lower socioeconomic status. Maybe they're unable to get to the doctor as frequently or whatever other factors that can make it difficult for them to have a complete series of required vaccines. Obviously income plays a part in being able to pay for your doctor visits and things like that. So the point is that there is another area to look through here. And the area has to do with these conditional entrants, these kids that are missing doses or unavailable to get their records or whatever else happening. It's not children with exemptions that are to blame. And so this is the study I was talking about where I quoted the 22 doses. There's another study in Vaccine Journal, Vaccine Journal, called Vaccine Exemptions and the Kindergarten Vaccination Coverage Gap. Okay, this is 2017, so this is current. And the whole point of this was understanding who has exemptions, because they've now, over the last 10 years, really, really been diving into why are parents opting out, who has exemptions, what are they for, and why. They really want to get in the head of these parents that are questioning because they're trying to find ways to counter that and get them to comply.
They're spending so much money and resources understanding why some parents are opting out instead of devoting those resources to fixing the reasons why parents are opting out.
Address the actual concern. Don't just get them to comply. So what they found in their results, which was really interesting, and this was specifically talking about the measles vaccine, is that only 2.7% of under-vaccinated kids were attributable to a parent who requested an exemption.
Wow.
2.7% in this study. And this, again, we're talking about measles vaccine. And when you think of only 3%, that means 97% had nothing to do with an exemption. Tell me why they think it's okay to remove religious rights and personal rights and make it so that completely healthy citizens are kicked out of a school system when they're not even the ones responsible for the missed doses, like the other study said. Another thing that I found really interesting here was when they talked about, like I mentioned earlier, out of the 5 to 7-year-olds, this is the kindergarten age range, only about 1.9% had parents that requested an exemption, across the state, which is very small amount. And that the people that did request an exemption had 96% of those had at least one vaccine dose, but on average were 22 doses.
Wow. Yeah.
22 doses were the average vaccine doses for any type for kids with exemptions. Again, kids without exemptions only had 28. So we're almost at the same range here. And
right. And these are kids that are probably, most of those are getting the whooping cough vaccine,
right,
the polio vaccine as infants. Probably a lot of them have had the first MMR vaccine, as we showed you in the data from the other study.
Right. And they were absolutely getting exactly what you're saying. Over 50% are showing doses for things like pertussis and for MMR and measles, mumps, rubella. But anyway, so They go on to say that popular media reports have focused on children with a parent that has requested an exemption, suggesting they are the primary cause of under-vaccination. This is what they say. But they say, our analyses of nationally representative data found that only approximately 1.9% of children had parents who requested an exemption, and that children whose parents requested an exemption had been administered many vaccine doses on average. So it says these results are congruent with lots of other published scientific reports. Wow. They're saying what we see when we look at our data is that parents who are requesting exemptions are not responsible for under-vaccination in our country. Right. Think about what that says. Right. Parents requesting exemptions are not responsible for under-vaccination in our country.
Exactly.
But what does the media say? The absolute opposite. Right. Measles is coming back because of people opting out and these exemptions and unvaccinated, et cetera.
Yeah. So I think the one take-home message that you can share with legislators, you'd have to pull up, these 4 studies and show them, basically the abstract for the studies.
Right.
But basically exemption does not mean you are not vaccinated. The word exemption is not synonymous with being unvaccinated. And in fact, again, the majority of kids with exemptions are partially vaccinated in these studies.
And so what they say is their research implies that most under-vaccinated children who have attended kindergarten have not been fully vaccinated for reasons that pertain to factors other than their parent requesting an exemption.
Right.
They say that is, under-vaccinated children whose parent did not request an exemption represent a significantly more numerous pool of potentially susceptible children. The susceptible children, a big, huge pool of them, are the ones that are not requesting exemptions.
Right. They're planning to vaccinate. They just haven't finished it.
They're missing
doses.
They
can't afford it. Or again, maybe they lost their vaccine record. But they are either mostly or fully vaccinated in some cases.
And this just goes on and on about how this is not related at all to parents in New York that are requesting exemptions.
Interesting.
And it says their findings are not congruent with popular media reports that portray parents who request an exemption as having strong anti-vaccine sentiments. Yeah. They said that's not what their data shows because obviously these kids are having an average of 22 doses.
Yeah.
So clearly they're not anti-vaccine because their parents are getting them partially vaccinated. In some cases, almost completely vaccinated.
And this is a 2017
This is
study.
2017.
So this is an important study for people to use.
Yeah. So again, this is Vaccine Journal, and the title is Vaccine Exemptions and the Kindergarten Vaccination Coverage Gap. But again, nobody's looking into this kind of data to find out what's really there. All they hear is the media that says we've got a problem, and the problem is that more people are opting out and we need to get stricter with our legislation.
Yep.
So the last study that I had here was factors associated with refusal of childhood vaccines among parents of school-aged children. This is a case control study from 2005, and they found similar results. almost 80% of the children in their study that had exemptions were vaccinated. So in some of these, we're talking about 80%. In some of these cases, it's 85, 90%. It's such a high percentage. And these are all separate studies, and they're coming to the same conclusion, which I found really to be interesting. And again, they keep coming back to the point that we need to push these immunization programs to maintain public confidence and to have this high immunization coverage. But then their data shows them it's not kids with exemptions that are responsible for low immunization coverage. They're not the ones that are responsible. And one of these quotes I found really interesting. It says, a lot of studies have examined the knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs of parents regarding vaccination, right? Because they're trying to get in their head what's going on. Some investigators found no association between parental beliefs and vaccination. Others found other things had to do with, vaccine safety and efficacy. But it said most unvaccinated preschool children, however, receive recommended vaccines by school entrance. That's another thing people don't talk about. Most kids that may be unvaccinated by 2 or 3, by the time they're 5, getting into kindergarten, may receive vaccines. And, the studies that show us how many kids are unvaccinated are based on 19 to 35 months. So when we see that 1.2% of our national rate of unvaccinated kids, that's based on the National Immunization Survey, that could be skewed because by the time that child is 5 years old and in kindergarten, especially in like rural areas, that child may be fully up to date with what's required by their school entry. So it's not even indicative of what percentage of unvaccinated kindergartners we might have or older children that we might have. It's still a low number. But even this says that they found that most unvaccinated preschool children receive the recommended vaccines by school entry, which you wouldn't necessarily think that that's the case. But that's another factor that people aren't really looking in. How funny is this? It says, of the 391 parents of exempt children, 86 of those reported their children were fully vaccinated. That's 22%. 22% are like, what do you mean my kid's exempt? My kid's fully up to date. And this is just like what the other study was talking about, that they actually talked about some kind of issues with their medical transcribing because their kid's fully up to date. And so out of we have almost 100 out of the 400. Like, that's a big percentage of people that are saying, wait a second, my kid's actually fully vaccinated. And the most common reason that people were exempting was chickenpox, not surprisingly again. They said, again, only about 24% received no vaccines. I mean, over 75% did receive vaccines. We're talking about a very misunderstood element in this debate. Who has vaccine exemptions?
Right.
What do they have them for? How many doses do they have them for? This is something nobody talks about.
Right.
I mean, did you hear this come up at all?
No, not at all.
In any of the legislation and the battles and the discussions and the hearing? Didn't come up at all. If you have an exemption, you're a risk.
Right.
You're a threat to anybody immunocompromised. It doesn't matter that you might be totally covered for the one disease everybody seems to be worried about right now, which is measles. You could totally have that vaccine, but because you have an exemption, you're the reason we need to get a tighter law, which doesn't make any sense, does it? So it comes back again to this idea in this particular study, parents of exempt children were more likely to have higher than median level of education than parents of vaccinated children.
Whoa. Okay.
So we've talking
seen
about
that before,
right?
but,
At least some college. Now we're talking a difference between 60% to about 45%. That's a big difference. And education, higher education would lend itself to the fact that you maybe are more of a critical thinker and you do want to do your research and homework and you don't just blindly go along with something, but you want to make sure it's the right choice for you and your family. It's funny that they try to use that to penalize parents that are opting out. But in reality, according to data, these are the parents who are more educated and are doing more intellectual background on this. But go ahead.
Well, there's something interesting from the first study that we discussed, the Wisconsin study, that I wanted to touch on in the conclusion. It's similar to what you were just saying, but it almost doesn't make sense because more educated people are more likely to critically think about vaccine safety and might be more likely to opt out. The researchers in the first study concluded that our findings support the need for improved communications on scientifically validated vaccine safety information to the public. Like if we can get better at communicating vaccine safety to the public and to educate parents regarding the risks that vaccine preventable diseases pose to their children, if we can get better at that, then we will get better with higher vaccination rates. But I don't think the research would show that that's true. Right. Because it's not going to be true because people are, the more educated you are, the more you hear about vaccines, the more you're going to critically think about it. But the interesting thing is like a few sentences later, they say, additionally, there may be value in having vaccine safety studies conducted by independent investigators who are not funded by pharmaceutical companies.
Imagine that.
I know. And having improved vaccine risk communication from information sources that are considered credible by parents. I don't think I ever see that stated in the conclusion of any of these studies that, we need, vaccine safety studies conducted by independent investigators not funded by pharma. I mean, very few people are willing to write that into a research paper, and I'm kind of, fascinated that this group decided to include that, because that shouldn't matter, right? I mean, vaccines are safe and effective, and it shouldn't matter if pharma funds it. We all know they're safe and effective anyway. And so I wonder if to them, maybe they also wish, maybe the researchers also wish they could see safety studies not funded by pharma.
Well, one of the conclusions in this last study that they come to, which was interesting, says, quote, the high proportion of children with exemptions to only certain vaccines suggests that most parents are selectively choosing vaccines rather than opposing vaccines altogether. Again, this is not part of the discussion right now. Mm-hmm. You're either anti-vaccine or you believe in them. You're either vaccinated or you're not. And that's one of the things I always say when somebody goes, if your kid's not vaccinated, they can't come here. And I want to know, what does that mean? How many vaccines do they need to be vaccinated? And that's not something anybody is saying. Do you just need to be vaccinated for measles and then you can come to the birthday party? Or do you need to have X number of doses? Yeah. Who decides? Because state requirements are different and country requirements are different. Who decides what it means to be vaccinated? So because there is no real definition happening, the same thing's happening. If you opt your child out versus, no, I totally believe in vaccines and I'm not going to have an exemption, as if we're on two completely sides of the soccer field, different sides. But the truth is there are not such extremes. Right. What they're saying now is most parents with exemptions are selectively vaccinating. Most, not partial, but most. Mm-hmm. Most kids on average are getting 22 out of 28 doses, and those are the ones getting exemptions. They could be getting an exemption for hepatitis B, like an STD, or because they got chickenpox naturally and they don't need to get it.
Right. Or they just don't want the chickenpox vaccine.
Right.
And maybe their kid will catch chickenpox. And right now the public doesn't fear that, but the media are working on that.
Oh, for sure. I definitely see that coming. And so they conclude with the same type of idea that they're finding out that parents of fully vaccinated children, still 32% think that their immune system is too weak with this many vaccines. Still over 20% were concerned that they get too many. And what do they say about that? Instead of finding out if there's accuracy there, they say this data are similar to the findings in the other study we talked about. And it says this indicates the need for additional educational interventions for parents. So let's just keep inundating them with more media messages that say stop questioning. Let's not take into concern the fact that even the fully vaccinating parents are questioning, and the ones that are getting exemptions are questioning, maybe we should look into what their concerns are. No, they want to give you educational information to keep you from questioning. And then it says the parents with children considering exemptions should be targeted with extra effort. Jeez. And this is what their goal is, right? Their goal is to learn who these parents, learn who these parents are so they can control them, not so they can find a solution. And so anyway, these are 4 different studies that talk about children with exemptions. I find them very interesting because we have, as a country, we have very little understanding of who the children are that have exemptions, how vaccinated they are, if they are vaccinated, which illnesses are they vaccinated for? We don't have an understanding of that, and yet states are popping up legislation all over the place. And they're doing so with data that actually shows it's not going to do anything. Right. It's not going to do anything at all. We're literally taking away our human rights, our medical rights, and our educational rights. And there is not going to be any solution from these types of laws as it relates to increasing vaccination rates or decreasing the likelihood of these particular illnesses in the schools. And I mean, it's shocking to see this kind of information and know they're still moving forward with it and succeeding. Right.
Right. And one sort of agenda we see them take is, the Wisconsin study and maybe some of these other studies. They will also state at the beginning of the study that how their exemption rates are increasing in their state. Like one of them went from like 0.9 to something like 2.9 or something over like a 10-year period. They saw the exemptions increase.
Right.
So they have to present that as the problem. So you'll see each of these studies say, people, we have a problem in our state. Here's the problem. Exemptions are increasing. And then no one else reads the rest of the study, so they don't realize that these kids with the exemptions are actually only a small proportion of unvaccinated kids. They're just hoping you won't read the rest.
And similarly, in California, they were not even documenting partial vaccination status before 2015.
Right.
And so what happened was they had an overestimated amount of at-risk children. And they changed their documenting process in 2015, and then they tried to use that as proof that the law to remove the non-medical exemptions was working. Because look at how we have higher numbers in these individual disease categories. What they failed to disclose to anybody is that those rates were just as high before. Also, they just weren't even given to the State Department.
Right.
And so now they document it differently. And then they go, look how these laws are working. We took away non-medical exemptions and our rates are up. It's because they're changing the way they document it. And I have a feeling they're doing the same thing for every single state that they pass new laws for the next couple of years. They will change documentation styles so that they can show it worked and it was necessary. And the real test is going to be after 5 years or so. When you start to see that stuff level out and you still see outbreaks in these schools that are going to be happening amongst the vaccinated kids, that's when we're going to see that this legislation didn't make a difference and wasn't worth it for what was taken away. And hopefully by that point, people have risen up even more to return those, you get those rights returned to them. Right. Because data, the kind of data we bring you guys, is not backing up the need for these kinds of things. And you guys need to keep looking through this kind of stuff and finding this kind of data and continuing to go deeper and see if your state, what the numbers are from your state public health department. Don't just take their word for it.
Right.
You go do the research yourself so you can arm yourself better when you do talk to legislators.
Yep. And that's our job to bring these mandate laws to an end someday. Well, thank you guys for tuning into this. And again, a very hopefully useful episode for people to be able to take these data to your legislators as reasons why we don't need vaccine mandates.
And stay tuned for a special episode. We are going to have a special announcement for all of you guys, and you're not going to want to miss it. Yeah. So the next episode after this one.
Yeah, my friend Stephanie from Canada, shout out to Stephanie. Hey, Stephanie. She emailed me. She's like, oh, is this what you guys are doing? She was guessing based on our last podcast. And I don't think I got back to her
Did she
yet,
guess right?
Yeah, kind of.
Kind of? Okay.
She wanted to know if you're coming too.
Don't tell him.
Oh, wait, should we cut that out?
All right, thank you guys for joining us again on Season 2 of the Vaccine Conversation Podcast with Melissa and Dr. Bob. And we'll see you next time.
The information in this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as medical advice. Always consult your healthcare professional for information on vaccines and infectious diseases.